Concept 5.4, global migration. Key concept 5.41 states migration in many cases was influenced by changes in demographics in both industrialized and unindustrialized societies that presented challenges to existing patterns of living. So basically here we're going to be focusing on obviously migration patterns, people moving in countries, out of countries, and how that was influenced by changes in demographics. Demographics would mean changes in population. So a good example of that would be subcontinent A. Changes in food production and improved medical conditions contributed to a significant global rise in population. So, why is population growing? Notice I underline improved medical conditions. I think that's important, right? People were living longer because they were getting more medical attention, and also food production. We go back to throughout history, agrarian production constantly continues to improve, and even during the late 1800s, we see new innovations like crop rotation, right? Rotating a field so that the field could rest, and then the next season the soil would be stronger and better. Then you have the seed drill. I found this online. Not what I thought it would be, but it's helping farmers obviously plant seeds. So these are just new innovations. You've got obviously the mechanical reaper. That was an American innovation in the mid to late 1800s. We're beyond steel plows, even though we have them now. We have mechanized plows, right? And also the potato, that Columbian exchange item, that's going to help over many, years. That's going to help populations grow. A positive effect of that Columbian exchange. So as populations grow, people are going to move, right? Whether it's to find a place that's not as populated, or when you see populations grow, there's going to be perhaps competition for work. So that's subconcept B. Because of the nature of new modes of transportation, both internal and external migrants relocated to cities. So as populations grow, so does immigration. This pattern contributed to the significant global urbanization of the 19th century. The new methods of transportation also allowed for many migrants to return periodically or permanently to their home society. So transportation methods would be the steamship, right? The Titanic is a really great example of that, right? If you've ever seen the movie Titanic. Also, railroads, right, within Europe. We don't have planes yet during this time, so we're sticking to more, traditional forms of transportation. So a couple of pieces of evidence to also remember would be the enclosure movement. That may not have to do with transportation, but it's a factor in migration. So remember, the government begins to kind of force renters or squatters off of government land, and they begin to enclose that land and sell that land. So those out-of-work farmers or those squatters, they're going to move to cities to find jobs in factories. I think, that I definitely, please remember that piece that had a huge impact on the growth of cities in Europe. Japanese migrants would go to Hawaii for seasonal work on those plantations in Hawaii, those fruit plantations, and return back. Also, they're bringing back that American culture, perhaps, that they picked up. Chinese workers traveled to the U.S. To work on the Transcontinental Railroad. Some stayed, some did not, some returned back to China. So those are some good examples of migration. And remember, understand that periodic, right? They weren't always staying in the Americas or in Hawaii. They would return home and, again, bring back maybe some of the Western ideas that they picked up on. Key concept 5.42 states migrants relocated for a variety of reasons. The enclosure movement is one. Railroad jobs for Chinese workers would be another. So we've already kind of mentioned this. Subconcept A states many individuals chose freely to relocate, often in search of work. So maybe they weren't pushed out of their country because of disease or because of war. Perhaps they just wanted to, find more money. I think Chinese migrants would be a great example of that. The Taiping Rebellion, though, is something that might have forced them out. There was also a plague happening. So because of the poverty that was growing during the Qing dynasty, many left, right, and came to the United States. Some even went to help build railroads in Mexico and Australia as as those regions began to industrialize. And they're going to bring their culture, right? They're going to bring Chinese culture. And they're going to establish ethnic enclaves, right? Little communities like Chinatown in San Francisco or Chinatown in New York. Um, you know, Italians are going to establish ethnic communities. Irish are going to establish ethnic communities in big cities like Boston and Chicago. And that's another group, right? Irish immigrants coming here during the late 1800s, during the potato famine. Remember the potato famine? Potatoes were diseased in Ireland, forcing people to leave. And Italian and Russian immigrants in the early 1900s. I think of the Godfather movies. They're going to come here as well, seeking Russian Jews, especially who are facing harassment, pogroms in Russia, and Italians were struggling perhaps with poverty in their home states, and they come here for better opportunities. Subconcept B states the new global capitalist economy continued to rely on coerced and semi-coerced labor, including slavery, Chinese and Indian indentured servants, and convict labor. So now we're focusing on maybe workers who came over here, not that they were forced, but they were really under the control of someone else. So we see, European nations are recruiting indentured servants from China to work on sugar and pineapple plantations in the Caribbean. Remember, an indentured servant is you sign that contract. You have to work until your debt's paid off. If you don't pay off that debt, if you don't work, you're probably jailed. We're going to see indentured servants from India, and to a lesser extent, China and Japan. But again, an indentured servitude was something that we saw in the Americas in the 1600s. In the Virginia colony, for example, English indentured servants, and that continues on. And then eventually freed slaves in the Americas became indentured servants, right? But so this is something that has been happening for many, many years. Indian laborers were working in the Caribbean in addition to Fiji, and then Dutch Guyana, which has if you know about Guyana, has a lot of Indian influence there. I think I spelled that wrong. And then penal colonies, right? Australia was a prison colony for English, and Irish convicts ended up in Tanzania, the Tasmanian devil. All right, key concept 5.43 states the large nature of migration, especially in the 19th century, produced a variety of consequences and reactions to the increasing diverse societies on part of the migrants and the existing population. So now we're focusing on how the growing nativism, racism, discrimination, and good examples of that would be, not just racism, but how certain gender roles changed. And a great example of that would be as more men left to the Americas or to Africa or wherever, women in the home were taking on new roles. We saw that in China, right? As Chinese migrants left, women kind of were given more opportunity. Maybe not politically, but they were maybe taking on more roles outside of the home. And we talked about the ethnic enclaves that were bringing, Chinese culture to the Americas, for example, like Chinatown in San Francisco. C states, receiving societies did not always embrace immigrants as seen in the various degrees of ethnic and racial prejudice and the way states attempted to regulate and increase flow of people across their borders. Great example of regulating immigration or prejudice towards immigrants would be the Chinese Exclusion Act. Congress bans Chinese laborers. These workers coming over to work on the railroads, for example, they were banned. An Angel Immigration Station. I think we studied Angel Immigration Station freshman year, but basically this was like the Ellis Island of the West Coast, but the conditions were very difficult. To be a Chinese immigrant in Angel Island meant you definitely were staying there much longer. The conditions were harsher. The dormitories were more difficult to deal with, and even medical exams were kind of invasive. To the Chinese struggled with these inspectors touching them. It kind of went against cultural aspects. So I think that's another great example of the struggles that immigrants might have faced. And the nativism, right? Anti-immigration sentiment. Chinese were segregated in the Americas. In many cases, their braids were cut off in the Americas. There were attacks on Chinese. So I think that's a good example of growing racial discrimination in the Americas. That's it.